Alright, moving on to Chapter 6 with the Age of Jackson from 1824 to 1840. First thing we're going to look at is something called Jacksonian Democracy, which you may at some point be asked to compare and contrast with Jeffersonian Democracy, and we'll look at that in just a minute. As far as the key tenets or the main points of it, first, Jackson was seen to both have a great respect for the common man, much like in Jeffersonian Democracy, but also to represent the interest of the people and the fact that he was seen as a common man as well. Moving on to the bottom with C, one of the key components of Jacksonian Democracy was the patronage system, which we refer to as the spoil system, as you can see on the left. We talked about it, and it's once again a policy of placing your political supporters in office. And we talked about, if you recall, some of the advantages and disadvantages of that. So you need to think about those as you go through this page. So looking a little bit more closely at Jeffersonian and Jacksonian democracy in a comparison chart, you can see as you look at this, a lot of the differences between these two forms of government, democracy, etc. are contained in the political and economic realm. As you move down the chart into the social aspects of it, you see a lot more similarity between these two kinds, and it's pretty indicative of the time periods that they lived in. By the way, this is not in the review book or the outline. You need to take some notes on this or run through this presentation several times because you're probably going to see this again. So the first part we're going to look at is the political, and the first question is the extent of white manhood suffrage on a universal basis. In other words, all white males being able to vote. Jeffersonian democracy believes that there should be some requirements, and the main one is the ownership of property. Jackson, on the other hand, once it got to him, the property owning aspect of being able to vote was eliminated from the process. Next is the eligibility for holding political office. Jefferson was a little bit more aristocratic with it, in that he believed there should be an educated elite who ruled the country. To expand on that a little bit, he felt that everyone should have an opportunity to this education, but until you achieve it, you shouldn't be allowed to rule. Jackson, on the other hand, believed that all men were qualified to hold office. Okay, so that's a main difference right there. Next is candidates for president and how they're chosen. Under Jefferson, it's done through the caucus system. In Jackson, it's nominating conventions. Rolling on to economic, and the concept of a chosen class. Jefferson believed that the chosen class was the everyday farmer. Jackson expanded it out a little bit and believed it was planters, farmers, laborers, and mechanics who were contained in the chosen class. As far as industrialization goes, Jefferson and his followers believed that there were going to be some bad consequences of it down the road. Jackson accepted the industry as it was because his presidency was on the forefront of the Industrial Revolution in the U.S. Scrolling on down to the Bank of the United States, this is where we get into the similarities. Both of them disapproved with it, at least at first, okay, and disagreeing. They disagreed with it for different reasons. Jefferson felt that it was wrong based on his interpretation of the Constitution. Jackson believed it was a monopoly of the rich, taken away from the common man, the common planter, etc. As far as social, with slavery and equality for women and African Americans, both of them owned slaves. Attitudes were a little bit different on it, but at the end of the day, they both owned them. And equality for women and African Americans, neither saw them in any way, shape, or form as being on equal footing with white males. So now we move forward to the major events of Jackson's presidency, and for your purposes, you need to know three main things. Number one is the Tariff of Abominations, number two is the Bank War, and number three is Indian removal. The first thing we're going to look at is the Tariff of Abominations that comes out in 1828. Now, a little background on that. Between the years of 1816 and 1828, we began to pass tariffs in the United States that are a little bit different than the ones that have come out before, and they're different in the fact that the primary purpose is for the protection of northern industries. If you look at the top left corner of the screen with this little chart here, you can see from the northern perspective why they would be in favor of this. As you can see, when this tariff is passed, number one, foreign goods are made more expensive. When this happens, people in the United States are more likely to buy goods that are made in the United States because they're going to be cheaper. They're going to get to save money, so it makes perfect sense. Number three, as this happens, the northern industries begin to see profits go up and things like that. So they continue on the economic cycle on the upswing. So they're making more money. Everybody's happy. Everybody's happy in this case except the South, who is going to get hurt from their perspective or their point of view by this tariff. And as you can see from the map on the bottom left, it's a pretty, the split is pretty much based on sectional differences, with every southern state outside of Tennessee being against the tariff, every state above the Deep South being for the tariff. And the reason that the South is against it is because it hurts them in the long run. Because when you put a tariff on for protection, you invite what are called trade wars. And in this case, with Europe and particularly England. The South doesn't want to get involved in one of these because a majority of their international exports of cotton are to England. And when this tariff goes into effect, England begins to buy less and less cotton from the South. So they see the tariff as being favorable to the North at the expense of the South. So as this tariff begins to be argued, the main name that you need to know with regards to opposition to it is John C. Calhoun. And the reason for that is he comes out with a philosophy or a doctrine called nullification, which basically means a state can refuse to recognize an act of Congress if it considers it unconstitutional. Okay, so one, he thinks that this tariff is unconstitutional. Two, he doesn't like it because it's at the expense of the South from his point of view, so he's going to come out and be against it. In opposition to him is Daniel Webster, who is from the North and rejects nullification in his Webster-Hayne debate. The next thing we're going to look at is the bank war, and basically it boils down to Jackson's veto of the recharter of the National Bank, or the Second Bank of the United States. Now, as we looked in that chart earlier, Jackson and Jefferson were both opposed to the National Bank, but on different perspectives. Jackson wants to get rid of it or doesn't want it around because he believes it's, quote, bastion of special privileges, or it's for the benefit of rich East Coast bankers and manufacturers at the expense of the common man from the South and the West, so he wants to get rid of it. He also believes it's against, as you can see at the bottom, the common people who elected him. So he's vetoing this recharter because he believes the people that voted for him are not for it and are being hurt by it. As far as the consequences of Jackson's bank war, and you probably need to be aware that this bank war was against a guy named Nicholas Biddle. Okay, the consequences are as follows. One, it leads to removal of federal deposits from the Bank of the United States, in effect to weaken it. Number two, an expansion of credit and speculation. Speculation is one of the key terms of this unit, or has been a key term all year. You need to know what that means. Number three, the number of state banks begin to increase because of the lessening of the power of the federal banks. And also, last but not least, the emergence of a competitive two-party system, which we still have in effect today. Moving on from there to Jackson and Indian removal. This all gets started, in effect, if you look at the map in the bottom left here. In the southeast of the United States at this time, there's quite a bit of Indian land that is not available or not available to white settlement. As more and more people begin to move down to the southeast and the expansion of cotton happens and farming, etc., this land becomes more valuable and people want to start settling on it. Well, in response to that public pressure, the fact that this land can be used for economic reasons and whatever, Indian removal is the proposal that is put forth. So they decide to move all these guys over to the Midwest, particularly in Oklahoma, what is now Oklahoma and Kansas. As this happens, there's one tribe that resists against this, and it's the Cherokee Nation. And what they do is they go through the court system to try to keep from being removed from their land. And they win in the case of Worcester versus Georgia, where the Supreme Court upheld the rights of the Cherokee tribe to their tribal lands. Well, this doesn't sit very well with Jackson. As you recall, not very good relations or a good view of Native Americans. He refuses to recognize the court's decision, declaring John Marshall has made his decision, going back to the Marshall Court, now let him enforce it. So he's going to basically ignore this court decision and move these guys off of their lands to the western portion. So the main result that you need to be aware of when it comes to Indian removal is the Trail of Tears, which is referring to the route taken by Native Americans as they were relocated to the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. So in other words, the trip west that they took from their homelands. We went through in class the conditions and how they were not the greatest in the world, about how some people were too sick, old, etc. to make the trip. The result of this is that 1/4 of the Cherokee people died on this trip. Moving on from there to planters and slaves in the antebellum South, and we're going to talk a little bit about the expansion of slavery during this time, and it's mainly because during this time period, cotton becomes the most important crop in the South, or the most important cash crop, and there's several reasons for this. First of all is the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, which makes it possible, and here are the key words we talked about in industrialization: quicker, easier, and cheaper to produce cotton. And as you can see from the chart here in the top left, that cotton production goes into a dramatic increase after 1850 when this thing becomes widespread. Second of all is the new farmland that was developed in the Deep South that ends up pushing the major center of cotton production to the south and the west. If you look at the map on the left side, you can see the change over time from 1820 to 1860, and also that you can see not only is it more widespread, but also the center of production moves along the Mississippi River in the Mississippi Delta, and also a belt along the Deep South in Alabama and Georgia. And third is the simple rise in demand that comes in England because of their Industrial Revolution. They're needing a lot more of this stuff. The South is producing tons of it. So it's a very natural economic relationship to develop. Moving from there to Southern society, we talked about this plenty, but keep it in the back of your mind that a majority of farmers in the South were small during this time. I know everybody has this view in their head of Gone with the Wind, the plantation system, Tariff, that kind of stuff. But a majority of families in the South were small farmers that couldn't afford to own slaves. So even though a majority of white families in the South didn't own slaves at this time, they were dwarfed both politically and economically by a small minority of planters in the South who owned 20 or more slaves. So in other words, we're talking about these plantation planters and owners, kind of the things that you do picture in your head from Gone with the Wind. Moving from there to slave society, some of the key characteristics you need to be aware of if you're asked a question with regards to this. Number one is that social networks were developed and maintained between slaves during this time, between their family and friends. The southern slave population, unlike a lot of places in world history up to this point, it wasn't reliant on the constant importation of slaves. They were able to maintain their labor force by natural reproduction, or having babies, if you want to think of it like that. Some free African Americans were able to own property. They were generally able to marry, and also because of the oppressive conditions and the reluctance to accept the culture of America because of the obvious oppression that they went through, they developed their own unique African American culture that includes foods, music, religion, and things such as that. And also, there weren't many slave revolts in the South. We talked about the Stonewall Rebellion earlier, but these things were few and far between, and certainly weren't large revolts. So the way that they protested against their working conditions were mainly by calling in sick, or not calling in sick, but acting like they were sick, sabotaging equipment, and working as slowly as possible. Next, we move from slave society to the transportation revolution during this time period. As far as the new developments go, we've got canals, specifically the Erie Canal, which you see up here in the top left, and also steamboats as a result of these canals, and the expansion of waterways, and also railroads. Now, railroads are in their formative stage at this point. They're not really widespread, but as we move forward to the period after the Civil War, you'll see an explosion in railroad expansion due to the opening of the West. The consequences of this, look, the main one you need to be concerned with is that it begins to strengthen and reinforce commercial and political ties between the major cities of the East, including New York City, and the growing cities on the Great Lakes. So once again, it's quicker, cheaper, and easier to get products and people from the East to what is considered the West at this time, or further and further west. So once again, elaborating on it, the canals helped to open the West to settlement and trade. It dramatically increased river traffic while lowering the cost of river transportation, enabled farmers access to the markets of the East on a quicker, easier, and cheaper basis. And also, it's not a bad idea to remember, because it kind of foreshadows events that are to come, there was not a lot of impact of this in the South. There weren't any canals built, railroads, as you can see from the map right here. While there are some in the South, it's nowhere near on the level of density that you see in the North and Northeast. So, once again, it gives the South a perception that they're being left behind when it comes to economic matters. So that closes out this chapter. We will continue on in class with the rest of them. By all means, if you have any questions, let me know, but we'll move from there.